Hello, welcome to the Specialty Matcha podcast. I'm Ryan. This is my co-host Songjun Lee,
Hello,
and we're the
hello.
co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, so we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share our startup stories, and interview experts. So today we are going to talk about the long wanted death of ceremonial matcha. All right, so the discussion today is more of a sharing our opinion about the topic. So Ryan, what do you think about it?
Yeah, so we wrote it as an opinion piece, and kind of purposely made it sharp in its nature. We tried to consider like different sides of different arguments, but we're very against the terms ceremonial grade matcha. So the article outlines it saying that ceremonial matcha is dead, but long live ceremonial grade matcha, which is our way of saying it shouldn't exist anymore, but its existence was very useful. And now it's kind of an out of date term.
Yeah, it
So,
serves a historic purpose.
yeah, yeah, it's kind of outlived its life and is probably potentially doing more harm than good. And we'd love to hear other people's perspectives on this. So if you're listening to this and you very much disagree, we'd love to hear from you. We'd even love to have you on the podcast to have a more open and formal back and forth to discuss the merits of the term ceremonial grade matcha. The crux of the argument that ceremonial matcha is dead because it doesn't mean anything. It is a term that's not regulated. There's no particular government body in Japan or some tea organization in Japan that says, this is now ceremonial grade matcha. And there's this connotation behind the word ceremonial grade that tea ceremony practitioners endorse this product. This product is good enough to be used in a tea ceremony, and that's just not true. We both know that if we give some of that to an Amoto Senke teacher, an Ora Senke teacher from some of the lesser brands, they'll taste it and be like, whoa, what is this?
Yeah, it's like the lack of regulation and the legal connotation of such term is really, it doesn't mean anything anymore. Like everybody can label their, what they think is a better matcha ceremonial grade. But your ceremonial grade compared to my ceremonial grade might be like totally different from all aspects.
And when you commoditize something all under that same label, that same umbrella, it's a race to the bottom. The incentives are to make it then cheaper. Because if you're distinguishing yourself by the fact that it's ceremonial grade, right, the consumers are cost conscious, businesses are cost conscious. If you're a cafe and you're telling your consumers I serve ceremonial grade matcha, right, your job as a steward to that business should probably to find the cheapest one that tastes the best in that application. Or maybe even the taste is secondary. It needs to just be good enough. But, let's say that supplier disappears one day, you could easily swap that out and still make the claim that it's ceremonial grade. So it really commodifies what could be a very rich and thriving specialty market for matcha.
So Ryan, how would you segment the consumer market outside of Japan based on their expectations of existing matcha classification?
There's a lot to unpack there. It depends on how well the consumer is educated. So you have some consumers that realize that ceremonial grade is a sort of a meaningless term. And then they have to start sorting through other data. Where was this matcha made? Who made it? How long was it shaded? What was the cultivar? Was it first harvest or second harvest? Second harvest is usually in the summer and is generally worse. And they'll have to start relying on other labels. So there's definitely a large and growing segment of the market that realizes it's completely false. For people who are just getting into matcha, when they read the term ceremonial grade, it's a self-descriptive name. It's good enough that it's can be used in tea ceremonies and you should be able to drink it and it should be palatable with just water. Because unfortunately, traditional Japanese tea ceremony hasn't evolved into latte creation just yet. I think it might take a couple hundred years for them to make any change that's that large. And so, they're expecting something that's good, that's shade grown. And when you look on these different websites of how to recognize ceremonial grade matcha, what to look for, right? They're talking about very basic things that people can easily tell, like the color, some basic things about the taste, that it was shade grown. Sometimes people will say it needs to be hand picked or stone milled. And traditionally that's the case, but the reality is most matcha that's labeled ceremonial grade is probably not hand picked. It might have not been shaded for very long. And it was probably not 100% stone milled, or part of it was stone milled and it was blended in with more industrial milling, like a ball mill.
Right. So if you were to install a grading system into Matcha, like what would be the criteria? Or like if a grading system will ever make sense for consumers?
These grading systems have an interesting history, and it's largely to protect a region or to protect a particular type of heritage.
Right.
So if we look at the wine industry or like Bordeaux, right, you have different appellations. So you have like Bordeaux wine, which is like a sort of a much larger classification system, but within there you can have different ones. So to have wine from like Saint-Emilion, for example, there are very specific rules about when you can harvest, and these rules apply to everyone, but they also change year to year. And actually, a lot of them are changing to adapt to climate change around how much you can irrigate, around the when and how you can use fertilizer or pesticide. And it has some utility in protecting the brand name of the region that it's from, where they have great control over these very bioregional products. So there's a lot of utility there. On the other side, there's a lot of harm. There's a lot of innovation that cannot happen under those classification systems. So if you look at the wine industry, there's a lot of criticisms of these classification systems because you could make decisions in the vineyard or in production that would yield higher quality, but you're not allowed to because they fall outside of the rules of those classification systems. And there's a really interesting winery in Spain that was just allowed to be labeled as Spanish wine, I think, but it wasn't allowed to hold any other labels or classifications because they just wouldn't listen to the rules. And it was just like some fantastically produced natural wine that were doing much more innovative techniques that are not accepted by the old guard. Um, to the extent to which this makes sense in matcha, I actually think we're not the right people to be speculating on that. It's the farmers and the regions that have their own names to protect.
Yeah, or if a grading system will ever make sense. Like, like for example, if you look at some of the region classification system, right? Like you have sometimes like the village tier, the DOCG tier, the DOC tiers, and some of the like the region has been installed for like hundreds of years, and that has never been changed. And like historic, you have some vineyard in those regions that are doing fantastic, but not anymore in modern era. And some of the lower tier wineries in like the village area starting to catching up and doing sometimes better than the
Yeah.
more prestigious regions. So like such regional classification system might not make sense in long term as well. So I would argue that a grading system will probably never make sense for like just about anything. Like things change, people's preference change, and I think the only thing that would make sense is transparent labeling. Like we
Yeah.
label the area, we label the cultivar, we label the processing method, and we let the consumer to decide, what their preference are and what they think is a higher quality matcha versus another.
I feel like classification systems in general need to be top down imposed. It is really hard unless some government or some local body is saying you are not allowed to sell this as this thing unless you do X, Y, and Z. It's just not going to work. You can't get everyone to agree on the same classification systems, and you just end up, you know, with a big mess of people using different labels or making up their own classifications and defining it themselves, and it makes it so we don't have a vocabulary to talk to each other. Whereas these like really transparent labels that you see like in coffee, for example, um, it's a very organic approach. It's very bottoms up. There's nothing complicated about listing the altitude that it was grown at, cultivar that it was from, the way it was processed. It just is a more descriptive, transparent label.
Yeah, or let's say how fine the powders are can also be a good criteria too. I
Yeah,
think it's
and the way it was milled.
yeah, I think it's some of these more neutral criteria that's listed on the label that provide enough information for consumer to make any decisions during purchasing scenarios that they can organically come up with their own system to decide which one is better than the other.
Yeah, they set their own standards. So that's a lot of critique so far of the term ceremonial grade matcha. But Zongjun, what's a case or an argument to be made about why it's been useful so far?
Well, I mean, like for matcha to be consumed, there are a lot of different ways, and you gotta have some sort of indicator of whether or not it's should be used as a culinary ingredient or a for drinking consumption, like for making a matcha drink or just drink the matcha by itself.
Mm.
So I think that historically it has been useful because like you might end up buying some really low quality matcha off from Amazon that are meant for be baked in a oven for like 200 degrees to make into a cookie versus something that you can comfortably mix with milk. So I think on that end, it served its purpose of helping people make the decision of whether or not you should be using this matcha for what kind of purpose.
I totally agree. So Zongjun, is there a universe where ceremonial grade matcha can coexist with what's we'll call it specialty grade matcha, where it's labeled just like coffee, where it's from, the cultivar, the way it was milled, and all those other pieces of information that make it very useful to make some sort of quality assessment? Can these terms coexist? Are they going to be in conflict? Or are they just talking to two different audiences? Like, how do you view this?
Yeah, I think they're gonna have to coexist for at least the near future, as we are trying to come up with more criteria in describing what a can of matcha really is. Versus you still have a lot of these legacy baggage that ceremonial matcha is already a installed term in consumers' mind that people will still inevitably trying to look for such thing whether is it on the internet or on the supermarket shelf. But at the same time, like I don't think it's in conflict of having a more detailed labeling of different matchas.
Mm.
Um, what do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I totally agree with the sentiment that it's just legacy baggage. They will have to coexist. I mean, unless like the US government or some other government comes in and creates a classification system and labeling standards, which is very unlikely, it's all going to have to coexist. And it will continue to confuse a lot of consumers, I think. And the other really dark side of the term ceremonial grade is it. I think it helps contribute to the I don't know what to call it, like the stuffiness that people associate with matcha and the complexity of its preparation. It's like, oh, I don't really understand the tea ceremony. There's so much more history here, and it makes it sort of this high in the sky thing, where it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be so complex, and it doesn't need to even be tied to ceremony for anyone to enjoy it. Um, so the fact that the best matcha on the market that you can buy now, with very few exceptions, some new vendors are dropping that term, but most of them use ceremonial grade, and it links it to tea ceremony and tea ceremony equipment and philosophy and expectations and standards. In my feeling is that it's really holding it back from being from the type of renaissance that we've seen in specialty coffee.
Right. Maybe we should come up with a smarter name to replace that, because that kind of consumer recognition will still be, I guess, inevitable in the future. Especially in the beginning of their education or knowledge journey of matcha. Like people who just got into matcha doesn't necessarily know anything about altitude or how long it has to be shade grown or the fineness of the powder. What's good or what's bad, like or what kind of a region the tea bush has been grown. They don't necessarily have that kind of knowledge to make a early decision on what's good and what's bad. So some kind of very surface indicator of the quality might still be necessary.
Yeah, for sure. Although I mean, I think specialty matcha is a decent like umbrella term to describe the idea of very transparent labeling. And I think it's really important so that consumers can predict their own preferences. I mean, exactly as you said, they might not understand the cause and effect relationships between the cultivar, the way it was produced, how long it was shade grown, the way it was processed, the way it was milled. But in order for there to be a thriving specialty market, they'll eventually have to make those connections. And that's the depth and breadth that makes any hobby around tea fun, is understanding that variation and exploring it and celebrating it. And that's what specialty matcha is. And, if consumers get burned enough time because they're not able to have a good enough mental model of what to look for on a label, and they buy something and they spent $40 and they didn't like it, right? You, as a consumer, you're only willing to do that so many times before you fall off the bandwagon.
Just once, most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, also, so you develop a set of complex preferences. If you, not to hate on any of the very traditional, original matcha brands that are very well respected and have been in Japan for hundreds of years, they have very poetic names that are hard to say. And I'm sorry, most people are not building a relationship or a preference for like a six-syllable name in Japanese that actually is some poetic meaning. You're just not. And they all have these weird names that are hard to remember. You don't know what's inside, and they don't allow you to develop any set of preferences about what you like or dislike. They're mysterious blends.
Yeah, it's quite the opposite of what specialty product should be. It's this man-made barrier of any preference development.
So, Zongjun, where do you foresee will get the most pushback? The article is titled Ceremonial Matcha Grade is Dead, Long Live Ceremonial Grade Matcha. Purposely quite provocative. Where would people disagree with this sentiment?
So I think the most pushback will probably come from vendors or people that have already invested a lot of effort in installing the idea of ceremonial matcha into consumers' mind. So they will probably get a little bit annoying because as we trying to promote the new standard of transparent labeling, they would inevitably be spending new effort and more money into trying to either come up with a description to match with what people wanted to know in the future, or they need to fight against that trend, which will also be a costly journey.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think the biggest pushback will be from people who have a vested interest in keeping this term alive, primarily because they've used it for so long. And I think what's going to end up happening is you're going to have a new generation of matcha companies exist, that are just going to look and feel different. They're not going to use that term. In fact, you're already seeing it. They're not going to use that term, and they're just going to start doing transparent labeling. You have companies like Oika, you have companies like Kettle. Kettle wrote an article recently talking about the fact that they don't use ceremonial grade term as a term anywhere on their website, no matter how bad that will hit them on SEO rankings. They decided just to drop the term altogether. for the similar reasons that we're talking about. It's just a meaningless term. It's kind of like how third wave coffee or specialty coffee separated from more second wave coffee from companies like Peet's and like Starbucks. Third wave coffee uses a different vocabulary. You don't see in a specialty coffee shop light, medium, and dark roasts. You just see different cultivars or different blends, or things optimized for espresso versus filter coffee. Really celebrating the fact that coffee is the seed of a fresh fruit and exploring all the flavor variation that can exist within it. So they really developed a new vocabulary and a new set of things to differentiate their products and their offerings. Where the old guard was still talking about light, medium, and dark roasts. So it's the reason that that's bad from if you're starting with very good coffee, if you roast it very heavily, it's a lot of that nuance, subtlety and nuance inherent in those beans is going to disappear, and just the roasted flavors are going to get expressed. So no one
Yeah,
takes fantastic base material and roasts it very heavy because it's still going to just end up tasting like any other darkly roasted coffee.
yeah, but even even with that, trying to grade coffee based on roastage is still an infinitely better classification than ceremonial grade, which you only have ceremonial grade.
Could you
Um,
imagine if you had a ceremonial grade coffee, or really any other product? It's just a ridiculous term.
yeah, like it's not really a classification system or grading system.
No.
Like you have culinary grade and ceremonial grade, and that's it. Like you don't even have a tier within ceremonial grade to
Yeah.
for people to decide what's better than the other. So I would doubt that the legacy baggage will be that heavy for people to get over it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's also the first thing that people learn about. Anyone who wants to get into matcha, there's 100 articles for you online to help you determine whether or not the matcha you're drinking is ceremonial grade. And then a bunch of affiliate links so that they can get their commission on whatever blog post that was. It's like at the very top of the funnel in like awareness and education about matcha.
I agree.
I mean, everyone who wants to get into it, it's natural to think, okay, what is good matcha? And when you answer that question right now, that is the very first thing that you come across. Until very recently, only the past couple of years do you start to see these newer companies break out and really change the discussion. I think they deserve a lot of credit. I mean, that took a lot of time, and this whole movement idea of transparent labeling and specialty matcha is going to take a lot of time. Um, and it's unclear who the first early adopters will be.
Yeah, but thanks to our peers, within the matcha industry, and also from coffee and wine and other specialty product, that we have at least a benchmark to reference. It's not like we're trying to create something out of the blue.
Yeah.
Like such grading system, such classification system already exist. In other specialty product. We just need to relocate that into matcha.
Yeah. To link back to the last podcast episode, it's about using existing knowledge structures and having them be useful to put that scaffolding in place to build up sort of what comes next in matcha. I was talking with a food professional in the early days, early 2000s. She was selling matcha to health food stores. And kind of back when Whole Foods was really cool, like way before the Amazon acquisition days. It's where consumers went to be educated on new healthy products. And she was telling me that it was actually a very easy sale. Those Whole Foods buyers already knew, or Whole Foods Whole Body, the whole body section, focused specifically on health. They knew what L-theanine was, they knew what catechins were, EGCG. They understood the health benefits, even extrinsic to matcha. Um, and it was a very easy sell. And like matcha really in the early 2000s exploded across California and in Vancouver as well, and then spread to the rest of North America, particularly through health food stores, and then really caught on a lot of steam in 2013, 2014. actually right around the same time when we started learning matcha, about matcha and about tea ceremony. And then what you start to see was a bunch of low quality matcha enter the market around that peak. And then people were really pushing ceremonial grade, because this really low quality stuff, some of it from Japan, some of it from mainland China, entered the market. And it made a really bad first impression on people. They would taste it, say, matcha's not for me, I don't like this. And part of the reason why is, probably wasn't shade grown, wasn't great base material. It was all industrially ball milled. Um, so everyone really leaned in hard, to the term ceremonial grade matcha to differentiate those products. And it's not now until the past few years that you start to see people break away from that, as more and more farmers in Japan are finishing their products as single cultivars to be purchased. Because if you also go back to the farm level, right, most of the time people were producing tencha, or the precursor to matcha, to be either blended or sold to another guy to blend. They weren't necessarily finishing it as a complete product.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. So we said a lot about, what ceremonial matcha should be or should not be, or what potential classification system can we use. But I guess by the end of the day, it's still for the consumers to decide which one they wanted to go for. I think our job is to really provide the knowledge and lay in the path, and for consumer to decide which path they want to necessarily work on.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think vendors are going to have to be the ones to do it too, right? Because a lot of the matcha education happens at the vendor level and describing what differentiates their products. So if single cultivar matcha isn't for sale, there'll be no consumer demand for it, most likely. So it's a push and pull.
Yeah, we will see what will happen in the near future.
All right, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you for listening. You can find this podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts, and please share it with the friends. And I think we have very few ratings, so if you gave us 5 stars, that'd be great.
Let's go.
Um, we're going to produce more content, and looking forward to it. And take care.
Maybe a start system works for classification. 5-star matcha. That's what I
Five
want.
stars. Only 5 stars.